The morning sun cast long shadows across the naval base as Admiral Marcus Sterling stepped out of his black sedan. His crisp white uniform gleamed with medals and ribbons that told the story of 30 years in service. At 55, he carried himself with the confidence of a man who had never been told no, never been challenged, and certainly never been outranked by anyone he deemed unworthy. Sterling adjusted his cap and surveyed the bustling activity around him. Today was special. The Navy was hosting an international maritime security conference, and representatives from allied nations had gathered to discuss joint operations in troubled waters. It was exactly the kind of event where Sterling thrived, where his reputation and influence could shine brightest. "Admiral, your briefing materials." His aide, Lieutenant Johnson, appeared at his side with a thick folder. "Thank you, Johnson. Any last-minute changes to the guest list?" "Yes, sir. There's been one addition. A representative from the European Maritime Defense Initiative will be joining us. She arrived this morning." Sterling raised an eyebrow. "She? I wasn't aware they were sending a woman. What's her rank?" Johnson glanced at his notes. "The documentation just lists her as a conference delegate, sir. No specific military designation was provided. Probably some diplomatic attaché trying to play with the big boys." Sterling muttered dismissively. "Well, no matter. Let's get this show on the road." The conference hall buzzed with conversation as uniformed officers from various nations mingled over coffee and pastries. Sterling moved through the crowd like a shark through water, commanding attention wherever he went. His booming laugh echoed across the room as he shared war stories and strategic insights with fellow admirals and generals. It was during one of these animated conversations that he first noticed her. She stood alone near the refreshment table, quietly observing the room. She appeared to be in her early 40s, with shoulder-length auburn hair pulled back in a simple style. Her clothes were understated. A navy blue business suit that seemed almost plain compared to the elaborate uniforms surrounding her. She wore no visible rank insignia, no medals, no indication of military service at all. "Who's the civilian?" Sterling asked Admiral Rodriguez from the Mexican Navy, nodding toward the woman. "I'm not sure," Rodriguez replied. "She introduced herself earlier, but I didn't catch her full credentials." Sterling's eyes narrowed slightly. He had little patience for civilian interference in military matters, especially when it came from someone who looked like she belonged in a corporate boardroom rather than a naval conference. As if sensing his attention, the woman looked up and caught his gaze. She nodded politely in acknowledgement, but Sterling merely turned away dismissively. He had more important people to speak with than some bureaucrat who had probably never set foot on a ship. The formal presentations began an hour later. Sterling delivered his keynote address on maritime dominance in the 21st century with his usual flair, commanding the stage like the seasoned leader he was. His voice boomed across the auditorium as he outlined strategies for naval supremacy, peppered with personal anecdotes from his various deployments. "The seas require leaders who understand not just tactics and technology, but the weight of command itself," he declared, his chest puffed with pride. "Those who have earned their place through blood, sweat, and decades of service. There's no substitute for real experience, for having salt water in your veins and steel in your spine." Scattered applause filled the room. Sterling's eyes swept across the audience and found the auburn-haired woman again. She sat in the third row, her expression unreadable, neither impressed nor dismissive, just watching, evaluating. It irritated him more than he cared to admit. During the break, Sterling found himself standing near the coffee station when the woman approached. Up close, he could see that her eyes were a striking green, and there was something about her bearing that suggested military training, though her civilian clothes made it hard to be certain. "Admiral Sterling," she said, extending her hand. "I enjoyed your presentation. You certainly have a commanding presence." Her accent was slight, European, though Sterling couldn't place it exactly. Her handshake was firm, confident. "Thank you, Miss Carter." "Elena Carter. Ah, yes, from the European Maritime Defense Initiative," Sterling said, his tone already becoming condescending. "Tell me, Miss Carter, what exactly qualifies you to participate in a conference of this caliber? I mean, no offense, but you don't look like you've spent much time on the water." Elena's expression remained neutral, though something flickered briefly in her green eyes. "Appearances can be deceiving, Admiral. I've found that the most valuable insights often come from unexpected sources." Sterling chuckled, a sound devoid of warmth. "Insights? My dear woman, insight comes from experience. From making life and death decisions while commanding vessels worth hundreds of millions of dollars and crews of hundreds of souls, it comes from understanding the weight of responsibility that rests on a commander's shoulders. You're absolutely right about the weight of responsibility, Elena replied smoothly. Though I might argue that true leadership is measured not just by the size of one's command, but by the wisdom to recognize expertise wherever it's found. Several other officers had begun to gather around them, sensing the tension building in the conversation. Sterling felt his audience and played to it. Expertise? He laughed again, louder this time. Miss Carter, with all due respect, what could someone like you possibly know about naval operations? Have you ever stood on the bridge of a destroyer in 15-foot seas? Have you ever had to make split-second decisions that could mean the difference between victory and disaster? Elena remained perfectly calm. I've had my share of challenging situations, Admiral. I'm sure you have, Sterling said mockingly. But there's a difference between whatever desk job brought you here and real military leadership. Some of us have earned our positions through actual service, not through political connections or diversity quotas. A murmur rippled through the small crowd that had gathered. Several officers shifted uncomfortably at Sterling's increasingly aggressive tone. Elena's composure never wavered. You seem very certain about what I have or haven't earned, Admiral. Though I'm curious, what makes you so confident in your assumptions? Sterling's face reddened slightly. Because it's obvious. Look at you. You walk in here in a business suit. No rank, no service ribbons, no indication that you've ever served a day in uniform. Yet you expect to be treated as an equal to officers who've dedicated their lives to defending their nations. I see, Elena said quietly. And you believe that a person's worth in military matters can be judged solely by their appearance? I believe that respect is earned, not given, Sterling declared. And some of us have paid our dues in ways that civilians could never understand. The crowd around them had grown larger now, with officers from several nations watching the exchange with growing discomfort. Admiral Rodriguez tried to intervene. Perhaps we should return to the presentations, he suggested diplomatically. But Sterling was on a roll now, feeding off the attention. No, this is actually quite educational. Miss Carter here represents exactly what's wrong with modern military thinking. Too many bureaucrats and not enough warriors. Too much political correctness and not enough backbone. Elena remained standing calmly, her hands clasped in front of her. You make some interesting points, Admiral. Though I wonder if you've considered that sometimes the most dangerous enemy is overconfidence in one's own superiority. Overconfidence? Sterling's voice rose. Lady, I've commanded more ships and led more operations than you've probably read about in your policy papers. I've earned every star on my shoulder through blood and sweat, not through sitting in committee meetings and writing reports. I'm sure your accomplishments are impressive, Elena replied evenly. Though I've found that the most effective leaders are often those who understand that there's always more to learn, more perspectives to consider. Sterling stepped closer to her, his voice dropping to a menacing whisper that was still loud enough for everyone to hear. Let me tell you something, sweetheart. This isn't some corporate boardroom where everyone gets a participation trophy. This is the real world, where real decisions have real consequences. And in the real world, rank matters, experience matters, and frankly, you have neither. The room had gone completely quiet now. Even the catering staff had stopped what they were doing to watch the confrontation unfold. Elena looked at Sterling for a long moment, her green eyes steady and unblinking. When she spoke, her voice was soft but carried clearly across the silent room. You're absolutely right about rank mattering, Admiral. It's one of the fundamental principles of military service. The chain of command exists for good reasons. Sterling smiled triumphantly, thinking he had won the argument. Exactly. And that chain of command exists to ensure that qualified people make the decisions, not desk jockeys with fancy titles. I couldn't agree more, Elena said. Which is why I find your behavior today so interesting. Something in her tone made Sterling pause. There was a subtle shift in her demeanor, a quiet authority that hadn't been there before. What's that supposed to mean? He demanded. Elena reached into her jacket pocket and withdrew a simple black leather folder. She opened it slowly, deliberately, and held it out for Sterling to see. The blood drained from his face as his eyes focused on the contents. His mouth opened and closed wordlessly as he tried to process what he was seeing. Inside the folder was an identification card and a set of credentials that made his own accomplishments look like a child's toy box full of plastic medals. The room was so quiet that the sound of Sterling's sharp intake of breath seemed to echo off the walls. Elena closed the folder and returned it to her pocket, her expression still perfectly calm. "Now then, Admiral, would you like to continue this discussion about rank and the chain of command? Or shall we proceed with the conference?" Sterling stood frozen, his face cycling through various shades of red and white as the full implications of what he had just seen began to sink in. Around them, the other officers looked on with a mixture of curiosity and growing awareness that they had just witnessed something extraordinary. The woman in the simple business suit, the one Sterling had dismissed as an unqualified civilian, the one he had lectured about earning respect and understanding the weight of command, had just revealed credentials that made his 30 years of service look like a brief internship. And the most devastating part was that she had done it all without raising her voice, without losing her composure, and without saying a single word that could be construed as disrespectful to a superior officer. Because, as everyone in the room was beginning to understand, she wasn't just a superior officer. She was in a league entirely her own. The silence stretched on as Sterling struggled to find words, any words, that might salvage what remained of his dignity. But Elena Carter simply smiled politely and walked back to the refreshment table, leaving him standing alone in the center of a crowd that was beginning to whisper among themselves. The morning's arrogance was rapidly transforming into an afternoon of reckoning, and Admiral Marcus Sterling was about to learn that sometimes the most dangerous assumptions are the ones we make about people we think we can safely dismiss. The conference was far from over, and Elena Carter was just getting started. Admiral Sterling's hands trembled slightly as he reached for his coffee cup, trying to regain his composure while the whispered conversations around him grew louder. He could feel dozens of eyes watching him, waiting to see what he would do next. The confident swagger that had carried him through the morning had evaporated, replaced by a cold knot of dread in his stomach. Elena Carter had returned to her position near the refreshment table, casually checking her phone as if nothing significant had happened. But Sterling knew better now. The way she moved, the way she held herself, the quiet authority that seemed to radiate from her. It all made sense now in a way that terrified him. Admiral Rodriguez approached Sterling cautiously. "Marcus, perhaps we should step outside for a moment." "No," Sterling said, his voice hoarse. "I need to know. I need to understand what just happened." He looked across the room at Elena, who was now engaged in conversation with General Morrison from the British Royal Marines. Morrison, a man Sterling had always found intimidatingly competent, was listening to Elena with obvious respect and deference. More telling was the way Morrison occasionally glanced in Sterling's direction, with something that looked disturbingly like pity. Lieutenant Johnson appeared at Sterling's elbow, his face pale with concern. "Admiral, I've been making some inquiries about Miss Carter. Sir, I think there's something you need to know." "What?" Sterling's voice was barely above a whisper. "Sir, she's not just a delegate from the European Maritime Defense Initiative. According to the conference registry, she's the Supreme Allied Commander for Maritime Operations in the North Atlantic." The words hit Sterling like a physical blow. The Supreme Allied Commander position was NATO's highest maritime authority, a role that superseded national boundaries and commanded resources that dwarfed anything Sterling had ever controlled. It was a position that reported directly to heads of state and had operational authority over virtually every naval asset in the alliance. "That's impossible," Sterling breathed. "She's too young. She's a woman. She's not even wearing a uniform." "Sir," Johnson continued carefully, "I also learned that she's been operating under her married name. Her full military designation is Admiral Elena Carter Volkov. She was formerly Admiral Elena Volkov of the Royal Norwegian Navy before her marriage. Sir, she's the architect of the Baltic Sea Defense Strategy and the primary author of the Maritime Domain Awareness Protocol that we implemented last year." Sterling felt the world tilt around him. The Baltic Sea Defense Strategy was legendary in naval circles, a masterpiece of strategic planning that had revolutionized how NATO forces operated in contested waters. He had studied it extensively, even cited it in his own papers. He had always wondered about the anonymous architect behind such brilliant work. Now he knew, and he had just spent the last hour publicly humiliating her. "Sir, there's more," Johnson said reluctantly. "She commanded the USS Enterprise battle group during the Somali crisis, but it was classified at the time. She was on loan to the U.S. Navy under a special exchange program. The successful resolution of that crisis was credited to operational planning by Allied advisors. But sir, that was her. Sterling remembered the Somali crisis. It had been a textbook example of naval precision and strategic brilliance. A complex hostage situation involving merchant vessels had been resolved without a single casualty, using tactics that military academies now taught as the gold standard for maritime crisis management. Elena Carter had planned and executed that operation. The woman he had dismissed as a desk jockey was responsible for some of the most successful naval operations of the past decade. Across the room, Elena excused herself from her conversation with General Morrison and began walking toward Sterling. Every step she took seemed to increase his sense of impending doom. Other officers stepped aside respectfully as she passed, and Sterling noticed for the first time that several of them nodded to her with obvious recognition. They had known who she was all along. "Admiral Sterling," she said as she approached, her voice carrying the same calm professionalism it had before. But now Sterling could hear the steel underneath. "I believe we were interrupted earlier. Would you care to continue our discussion about qualifications and experience?" Sterling's throat felt like sandpaper. "Admiral Carter, I apologize. I didn't realize." "You didn't realize what?" "Exactly." Elena's green eyes were steady on his face. "That a woman could hold high military rank? That someone in civilian clothes might have more authority than you assumed? Or that perhaps you shouldn't make judgments about people without knowing who they are?" The crowd around them had grown again, but this time the dynamic was completely different. Where before they had watched Sterling's arrogant performance with varying degrees of discomfort, now they observed Elena's quiet command with something approaching awe. "I made assumptions," Sterling said, his voice cracking slightly. "I was wrong." "Yes, you were wrong," Elena agreed. "But not just about my rank or qualifications. You were wrong about something much more fundamental." She stepped closer to him, and Sterling found himself unconsciously straightening to attention despite himself. "You were wrong about what leadership actually means," she continued. "Real leadership isn't about intimidating subordinates or dismissing people you think are beneath you. It's not about parade ground posturing or chest-thumping speeches about blood and sweat." Sterling wanted to respond, to defend himself, but the words wouldn't come. "True leadership," Elena said, her voice carrying clearly across the now silent room, "is about recognizing talent and potential wherever you find it. It's about creating an environment where the best ideas can surface regardless of where they come from. It's about understanding that the moment you think you know everything is the moment you become useless to the people you're supposed to serve." General Morrison had moved closer to listen, along with Admiral Rodriguez and several other senior officers. Sterling suddenly realized that this wasn't just a personal humiliation. It was a masterclass in leadership being delivered at his expense. "I've read your service record, Admiral Sterling," Elena continued. "It's actually quite impressive. You've had a distinguished career, and your tactical acumen is well documented, which makes your behavior today all the more disappointing." She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. "You see, I didn't just stumble into this conference by accident. I specifically requested to attend because I'd been considering you for a position on my staff. Your expertise in submarine warfare and your experience with joint operations made you an attractive candidate." Sterling's eyes widened in horror as he realized the implications. "Made," Elena emphasized. Past tense. The room was so quiet that Sterling could hear his own heartbeat pounding in his ears. The career opportunity of a lifetime, working directly with NATO's Supreme Maritime Commander, had just evaporated in front of dozens of witnesses. "But Admiral," he stammered, "surely you can understand that I was just—" "You were just what?" Elena's voice sharpened slightly. "Doing your job? Protecting military standards? Being a leader?" She shook her head slowly. "No, Admiral. You were being a bully. You were using your assumed position of authority to intimidate someone you thought couldn't fight back. That's not leadership. That's cowardice." The word hung in the air like a physical presence. In military culture, being called a coward was perhaps the most devastating accusation possible. And Elena had delivered it with surgical precision. "You talked about earning respect through blood and sweat," she continued. "Let me tell you about blood and sweat, Admiral. I've bled plenty during my career, literally and figuratively. I've sweated through decisions that kept me awake for days, wondering if I'd made the right choice or if my orders would send good people to their deaths." Elena's voice remained controlled, but there was a intensity to it now that made everyone in the room lean forward slightly. "I've commanded operations where the margin for error was measured in seconds, not hours. I've sat in situation rooms where the wrong decision could have started wars. I've stood on bridges in storms that would have terrified you, making calculations that held thousands of lives in the balance. She paused, her eyes never leaving Sterling's face. But here's what I learned through all of that experience, Admiral. The most important quality a leader can have isn't the ability to intimidate subordinates or impress audiences with war stories. It's the wisdom to recognize that you don't know everything, and the humility to listen when someone else might have a better idea. General Morrison stepped forward slightly. Admiral Carter is being modest, he said, his British accent cutting clearly through the tension. She's personally responsible for saving more lives and preventing more conflicts than any officer I've served with. Her innovative approaches to maritime security have become the global standard. Admiral Rodriguez nodded in agreement. The Mediterranean Stability Initiative she designed prevented what could have been a catastrophic regional conflict. When the politicians couldn't find a solution, they called her. Elena held up a hand to stop the testimonials. Thank you, gentlemen. But Admiral Sterling doesn't need to hear my resume. He needs to understand why his behavior today was so problematic. She turned back to Sterling, who looked like he wanted to sink through the floor. You see, Admiral, when you dismissed me as unqualified, you weren't just insulting me. You were demonstrating exactly the kind of thinking that gets people killed in real military operations. The assumption that you already know what you need to know, that your perspective is the only one that matters, that anyone who doesn't fit your preconceptions must be irrelevant. Elena's voice grew colder. How many times in your career have you dismissed input from enlisted personnel because they didn't have enough rank? How many times have you ignored suggestions from junior officers because they didn't fit your idea of what a military leader should look like? How many opportunities for innovation and improvement have you missed because you were too busy protecting your own ego? Sterling tried to speak, but Elena held up a hand. Those are rhetorical questions, Admiral. The answers are written all over your behavior today. She reached into her jacket again and pulled out her phone. With a few quick taps, she brought up what appeared to be an official document. I was prepared to offer you the position of Deputy Commander for Submarine Operations, she said, showing him the screen. It would have been a significant promotion and a chance to work at the highest levels of Allied naval strategy. The compensation package alone would have doubled your current salary, not to mention the career opportunities it would have opened up. Sterling's face went white as he read the details of what he had just lost. But military leadership isn't just about technical competence, Elena continued, closing the phone and returning it to her pocket. It's about character. And what you showed me today tells me everything I need to know about your character. She looked around the room at the assembled officers. I want to thank all of you for an enlightening morning, she said with a slight smile. I've learned quite a lot about the current state of Allied naval leadership. Some of what I've learned is encouraging, some of it, less so. Her gaze settled on Sterling one final time. Admiral Sterling, I suggest you spend some time reflecting on what happened here today. Real reflection, not just anger or embarrassment. Think about the assumptions you made, the conclusions you jumped to, and the way you treated someone you thought was powerless to respond. Elena began to walk away, then paused and turned back. Oh, and Admiral, the next time you meet someone at a military conference, you might want to ask about their background before you decide to lecture them about earning respect. You never know who you might be talking to. As Elena walked away, the crowd began to disperse, leaving Sterling standing alone in the center of the room. The whispered conversations that erupted around him were like daggers to his pride, each murmured comment a reminder of his spectacular failure. Lieutenant Johnson approached cautiously. Sir, the afternoon sessions are starting soon. Should I brief you on the schedule? Sterling looked at his aide, seeing the mixture of embarrassment and pity in the young man's eyes. He realized that the story of his humiliation would spread throughout the naval community within hours. By tomorrow, every officer in the fleet would know about the admiral who had picked a fight with his own supreme commander. No, Sterling said quietly. Cancel my afternoon appointments. I need to think. As he walked toward the exit, Sterling caught sight of Elena Carter, engaged in animated conversation with a group of international officers. They hung on her every word, clearly fascinated by whatever strategic insight she was sharing. For the first time in his career, Admiral Marcus Sterling understood what it felt like to be truly outranked, not just on paper, but in every way that actually mattered. And the worst part was that he had done it to himself. 3 months later, Admiral Marcus Sterling sat alone in his office at Naval Station Norfolk, staring at a letter that had arrived that morning. The thick cream-colored envelope bore the official seal of NATO Maritime Command, and Sterling had been dreading its arrival since the conference incident. The intervening months had been the most difficult of his career. Word of his confrontation with Admiral Elena Carter had spread through the naval community like wildfire. The story had been embellished and distorted as it passed from ship to ship, but the core truth remained unchanged. Sterling had publicly humiliated himself by attacking his own superior officer. His phone buzzed with an incoming call from Admiral Patricia Hayes, his direct superior and the Chief of Naval Operations. "Marcus, we need to talk," Hayes said without preamble when Sterling answered. "Yes, ma'am. My office. 1 hour." The line went dead, and Sterling closed his eyes, knowing that this conversation would likely be his last as an active duty officer. The letter from NATO Maritime Command undoubtedly contained his official reprimand, and Hayes was probably calling him in to discuss his resignation. But first, he needed to read what Admiral Carter had written. Sterling opened the envelope with trembling fingers and unfolded the single sheet of official letterhead. What he read surprised him so much that he had to read it twice to make sure he understood correctly. The letter was not a reprimand. It was an invitation. Asterisk Admiral Sterling. Asterisk. Asterisk I hope this letter finds you well. I wanted to follow up on our conversation at the Maritime Security Conference 3 months ago. Asterisk. Asterisk I've been thinking quite a lot about our exchange that day, and I believe there's more to discuss. Your reaction to discovering my identity revealed some important truths, not just about your own assumptions, but about the broader challenges facing military leadership in an evolving world. Asterisk. Asterisk I would like to invite you to participate in a special NATO leadership development program I'm organizing. The program focuses on adaptive leadership in joint operations, with particular emphasis on overcoming unconscious bias and improving cross-cultural military cooperation. Asterisk. Asterisk. Before you decline, please understand that this is not a punishment or a remedial course. You were right when you said that you've had a distinguished career. Your tactical knowledge and operational experience are genuinely valuable. What happened at the conference was a failure of judgment, not competence. Asterisk. Asterisk. The program would involve a 6-month rotation through various NATO commands, including time aboard vessels from partner nations and embedded assignments with allied forces. You would be working directly with my staff to develop new training protocols for international military cooperation. Asterisk. Asterisk I believe you have the potential to become a better leader than you were 3 months ago. More importantly, I believe you have the character to acknowledge your mistakes and learn from them. Asterisk. Asterisk. If you're interested, please contact my aide, Commander Sarah Mitchell, to discuss the details. The program begins next month. Asterisk. Asterisk. Respectfully. Asterisk. Asterisk. Admiral Elena Carter. Asterisk. Asterisk. Supreme Allied Commander. Maritime Operations. Asterisk. Sterling read the letter a third time, hardly believing what he was seeing. After the way he had behaved, after the public humiliation he had brought upon himself, Elena Carter was offering him a chance at redemption. More than that, she was offering him exactly the kind of career opportunity he had lost through his own arrogance. His thoughts were interrupted by Lieutenant Johnson entering with a stack of reports. "Sir, these need your signature." Before Johnson stopped mid-sentence when he saw Sterling's expression. "Sir, is everything all right?" Sterling held up the letter. "Johnson, do you remember what I said about Admiral Carter at the conference?" The younger officer shifted uncomfortably. "Sir, you said a lot of things that day. I said she was unqualified. I said she didn't understand the weight of command. I said she hadn't earned her position." "Yes, sir, you did say those things." Sterling stood up and walked to his window, looking out at the harbor where ships came and went on missions around the world. "Tell me honestly, Johnson, in the 3 months since that conference, what have you learned about Admiral Carter?" Johnson hesitated, clearly torn between honesty and diplomacy. "It's all right, Lieutenant. Speak freely." "Sir, I've done some research since then. Admiral Carter's record is extraordinary. The operations she's planned and executed, the innovations she's brought to naval strategy, the respect she commands from officers across multiple nations. Sir, she might be the most accomplished naval officer of our generation." Sterling nodded slowly. "And what does that say about my judgment that day?" "Sir, I don't think it's my place to." "Johnson, you've served under me for 2 years. You've seen me make decisions under pressure, handle complex situations, lead operations. Before the conference, what was your opinion of my leadership abilities? The young officer straightened. Sir, I thought you were one of the finest officers I'd ever served with. Decisive, knowledgeable, inspiring to the crew. I was proud to serve under your command. And after the conference, Johnson was quiet for a long moment. Sir, you're still a highly competent officer. But that day I saw something that disappointed me. I saw you use your rank to bully someone you thought couldn't fight back. That's not the leader I thought you were. The words stung, but Sterling knew they were true. And he also knew they represented exactly the kind of honest feedback that good leaders sought out, even when it hurt. Thank you for your honesty, Lieutenant. That took courage. Sterling returned to his desk and picked up his pen. He began writing a response to Admiral Carter's letter, but then stopped. There was something else he needed to do first. An hour later, Sterling sat across from Admiral Hayes in her Spartan office overlooking the Chesapeake Bay. Hayes was a formidable woman in her early 60s, known for her no-nonsense approach and complete intolerance for officer misconduct. I assume you've seen the reports about the NATO conference. Hayes began without preamble. Yes, ma'am. I've also received a letter from Admiral Carter. Hayes raised an eyebrow. Oh? And what did our Supreme Commander have to say? Sterling handed over the letter, watching Hayes's expression change as she read. Well, Hayes said finally, this is unexpected. Admiral Carter is offering you a significant opportunity despite your behavior that day. Yes, ma'am. I wanted to discuss it with you before responding. Marcus, let me be blunt. Your conduct at that conference was unacceptable. You embarrassed yourself. You embarrassed the U.S. Navy. And you demonstrated exactly the kind of thinking that holds our military back from reaching its full potential. Sterling felt his face burn with shame. Yes, ma'am, I understand that. Do you? Because I'm not sure you fully grasp what happened that day. This wasn't just about making assumptions about one person. This was about revealing a fundamental flaw in your leadership philosophy. Hayes stood and walked to her window. Marcus, you're a good tactical officer. You understand naval warfare. You know how to handle ships and crews, and you've served with distinction for 3 decades. But what you showed that day was that you've never truly understood what military leadership is actually about. She turned to face him. Military leadership isn't about proving you're the toughest person in the room. It's about maximizing the potential of every person under your command. It's about creating an environment where the best ideas surface regardless of where they come from. It's about understanding that diversity of thought and experience makes us stronger, not weaker. Sterling nodded, finally beginning to understand the full scope of his failure. Admiral Carter could have ended your career that day. Hayes continued. She had every right to file a formal complaint, demand your removal, make an example of you. Instead, she's offering you a chance to become the leader you should have been all along. Why do you think she's doing that, ma'am? Hayes smiled slightly. Because she's doing exactly what good leaders do. She's looking past your failures to see your potential. She recognizes that you have valuable skills and experience, and she believes you can learn from your mistakes. She returned to her seat. The question is, Marcus, are you ready to actually learn? Are you prepared to acknowledge that there are things about leadership you don't understand yet? Are you willing to put your ego aside and become a student again? Sterling thought about the past 3 months. He had replayed the conference incident countless times, each replay making him feel smaller and more foolish. He had realized that his arrogant performance that day wasn't an aberration. It was the culmination of years of gradually increasing self-importance and decreasing self-awareness. Ma'am, I've spent the last 3 months thinking about what kind of leader I've become, he said quietly. I don't like what I see. I've been so focused on maintaining my authority that I've forgotten why that authority was given to me in the first place. And why was it given to you? To serve, to make the people under my command better at their jobs, to help accomplish the mission. Exactly. And how well have you been doing that? Sterling considered the question honestly. Not as well as I thought. I've been more concerned with being respected than with being effective. Hayes leaned back in her chair. That's the most self-aware thing you've said in years, Marcus. It gives me hope that you might actually benefit from what Admiral Carter is offering. She picked up the letter and read it again. This is an extraordinary opportunity, she said, working directly with NATO's Supreme Maritime Commander, helping develop training protocols for the entire alliance, exposure to operational methods from dozens of different navies, Most officers would give anything for this kind of assignment. But Sterling sensed there was more coming. But it's also going to be the most humbling experience of your career. You'll be working with officers who know all about your conference performance. You'll be in situations where you're clearly the student, not the teacher. Your every action will be scrutinized to see if you've actually learned anything. Hayes fixed him with a steady gaze. Are you prepared for that, Marcus? Are you ready to be vulnerable? To admit when you don't know something? To ask for help when you need it? Sterling thought about Lieutenant Johnson's disappointed expression, about the whispered conversations that followed him everywhere now, about the crushing realization that he had spent years becoming exactly the kind of officer he used to despise. Yes, ma'am, I am. Then you have my recommendation to accept Admiral Carter's offer. But Marcus, this is your last chance. If you revert to your old behaviors, if you let your ego override your judgment again, it will be the end of your career. No second chances, no do-overs. I understand, ma'am. Hayes smiled for the first time since he'd entered her office. Good. Now get out of here and write your acceptance letter. And Marcus? Yes. Ma'am? Don't waste this opportunity. Admiral Carter is giving you a gift. Make sure you're worthy of it. That evening, Sterling sat in his quarters composing his response to Admiral Carter. After several false starts, he finally found the right words. Asterisk, Admiral Carter. Asterisk, asterisk. Thank you for your letter and your extraordinary offer. I accept your invitation to participate in the Leadership Development Program. Asterisk, asterisk. I want to be clear about something. I know I don't deserve this opportunity. My behavior at the conference was inexcusable, and it revealed serious flaws in my character and judgment that I'm only beginning to understand. Asterisk, asterisk. But I also want you to know that I'm committed to learning from this experience. I'm ready to be challenged, to be uncomfortable, and to confront the assumptions that led to my failure that day. Asterisk, asterisk. I realize now that true military leadership isn't about proving your superiority over others. It's about helping others become the best versions of themselves. I failed that test completely 3 months ago. Asterisk, asterisk. I hope to prove worthy of the faith you're showing in me. Asterisk, asterisk. Respectfully. Asterisk, asterisk. Admiral Marcus Sterling. Asterisk, asterisk. P.S. I've done my research. I know exactly who you are now, and what you've accomplished. I'm honored by the opportunity to learn from someone of your caliber. Asterisk. 6 months later, Admiral Sterling stood on the deck of a Norwegian frigate in the North Sea, watching Admiral Carter conduct a multinational training exercise involving vessels from 8 different nations. She moved through the complex operation with the effortless competence of a master craftsman, coordinating communications between ships whose crews spoke different languages and operated under different naval traditions. Sterling had learned more about real leadership in the past 6 months than in the previous 30 years of his career. He had served alongside officers from dozens of countries, learning their methods and perspectives. He had been mentored by leaders who challenged his assumptions and forced him to think differently about command and authority. Most importantly, he had learned to listen. As the exercise concluded, Admiral Carter approached him at the rail. So, Admiral Sterling, what do you think of your final evaluation? Sterling smiled. I think, 3 months ago I would have been looking for ways to prove I knew better than everyone else. Today, I'm just grateful for everything I've learned. And what's the most important lesson? Sterling considered the question carefully. That good leadership isn't about being the smartest person in the room. It's about making sure the room contains all the smart people it needs, and then getting out of their way. Admiral Carter nodded approvingly. That's a lesson that took me years to learn. You've made remarkable progress, Marcus. She handed him an envelope. Your new assignment, she said. If you want it. Sterling opened the envelope and read the orders inside. He would be taking command of a new NATO joint task force focused on developing integrated training protocols for Allied naval forces, essentially becoming the operational director of the program he had just completed. It was everything he had lost at the conference, and more. I don't know what to say, Sterling said quietly. Say you'll remember this feeling the next time you meet someone who doesn't fit your preconceptions. Elena replied. Say you'll give the next Elena Carter a chance to show you what they're capable of before you decide they don't belong. Sterling looked out at the mixed fleet of vessels surrounding them. American destroyers working alongside Norwegian frigates, British submarines coordinating with Danish patrol boats, crews from a dozen nations working together as one unified force. "I will," he said. "I promise." As the sun set over the North Sea, Admiral Marcus Sterling reflected on the most valuable lesson of his career. Sometimes the most important rank a person can hold isn't written on their uniform. Sometimes it's written in their character. And sometimes, if you're very fortunate, someone comes along who helps you understand the difference.